The number of people forced to flee from hunger, conflict and violence has crossed the number of 100 million worldwide, for the first time on record. Climate change, economic problems and most importantly, conflict, like in Syria, Afghanistan and Ukraine, are the main triggers for the crisis of today. But the worrying part is, this is just the beginning. Let's analyze where the people flee from, how these countries are sliding into collapse, and where the next 100 million will come from. Because yes, the numbers will increase. Let me explain why. And welcome to Dark New World. Imagine there's a conflict erupting in your home country. At first, it's only in the news. Then, food is becoming more and more expensive and slowly disappearing from the supermarket shelves. There's a run on gas stations and banks. The neighbors don't speak to each other anymore. At night, you hear more and more sirens. Until the conflict knocks at your door. In seconds, you became a refugee. This is the reality for more than 100 million people worldwide. Today. According to new data from the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, the number of forcibly displaced people worldwide rose towards 90 million by the end of 2021, propelled by new waves of violence or conflict in countries including Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Myanmar, Nigeria, Afghanistan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In addition, the war in Ukraine has displaced 8 million within the country this year, and more than 6 million refugee movements from Ukraine have been registered. In Ethiopia, a civil war broke out in 2020. The Ethiopian government is clashing with separatist forces of the Tigray region. Trigger of the escalation is a mix of different ethnicities that form the government of Ethiopia. The Tigray faction was in power for a very long time, but corruption and other issues were rampant. Eventually, discontent morphed into protest, leading to a government reshuffle that saw Mr. Abiy appointed as prime minister. When the central government cut funding to the Tigray region, the conflict escalated into a full civil war. By 2022, thousands are dead and 350,000 people have to endure famine-like conditions. Most refugees are fleeing into Sudan and neighboring countries. In Syria, the decade-long war has caused millions to flee the country. Most refugees are currently in Turkey and Jordan, with over 3 million refugees each, or in Lebanon with 1.5 million refugees. For Lebanon, that is 1 refugee for 4 citizens. In 2015 and 16, millions fled to Europe, to Germany, over Greece and the Balkans. A big number, but just a fraction of the total number of people displaced. The situation in Lebanon is about to get worse, so not only the 1.5 million refugees have to maybe flee again, but also the 7 million regular inhabitants of the small nation. In Ukraine, the Russian invasion caused the displacement of millions of people. While most are internally displaced and stay in western Ukraine, circa 6 million people have fled the country to Poland, Romania and Germany. The images of the summer 2015 are still in our minds. But what many thought to be the main crisis is actually just the first chapter in a much bigger, more complicated matter. All countries of origin of most refugees follow a certain pattern of collapse. Let's analyze what happened in the years prior to the mass exodus and apply it to the current world situation to predict the next dominoes that will fall. In general, there are 4 stages that lead to the collapse of the nations in our list. Not every country goes through each step, but still, most of them have at least 3 of the 4 issues presented here. Many of the countries that are threatened by collapse have all an economy that is in a bad state. Sometimes it's a war that happened years before. Sometimes it's mismanagement. Sometimes it's corruption, and most of the time, it's all combined. The rule that applies to every country is that wealth and a high living standard are the best methods of keeping conflict away. In most countries on Earth, that's not a given. When the living standard drops for already poor people, some will take to the streets and protest, which leads us to the second stage. Now, we have a catalysm that makes the bad situation even worse for many. At some point, people will take to the streets and demonstrate and demand reforms. Most of the time, it was the incompetent and corrupt government itself that brought the state into the situation. So they mostly answer with violence and oppression, which can escalate the situation even further. Sometimes government finds someone else to blame on the situation, from another state to a specific ethnic group. Examples here are Rwanda in the 90s, with the internal conflict between Hutu and Tutsi, or Iran blaming Israel and vice versa. Or a newer example like the Russians and the Ukrainians. Conflict is a powerful tool to legitimize your government. If things are further deteriorating, we enter stage 3, where limited conflict and violence, paired with an economic implosion, is creating actual shortages. This is the stage when the first people are turning their backs on their home country. At this stage, it's mostly wealthier individuals that have the financial capabilities to get abroad. It starts with selected items going missing on the shelves. Prices are soaring, and then we see fuel shortages. In most cases, you see long lines at gas stations, criminality is rising, and slowly but steadily, the government loses its grip on the people. Before we go to the last stage, you maybe realize that my scenario sounds like the start of a civil war. And there's a simple reason for that. With the world in trouble in 2022, we have to face a lot of problems. Resource and energy shortages will be the main reason for global economic recession. And this recession will destroy the already low living standard of many people in the world. You see where I'm going with this. Inflation, resource shortages, and many other problems will cause conflict. It will be worse than the Arab Spring. And it won't be limited to the Middle East this time. A lot of the economic systems in the world aren't very robust. In fact, the third world is in an absolute desolate state. And many of these states are already in a heavy crisis or are on their way to collapse in different stages. They will be the first dominoes to fall. Maybe you want to watch out for Lebanon and Sri Lanka. The last stage is usually a full-blown conflict. Thousands of deaths, no access to food and water, and millions of people on their way to a safe haven. In Syria, 50% of the population is either internally displaced or had to leave the country. Depending on the length of the conflict, many will never return. If, for example, the conflict in Ukraine will again escalate into the western part of the nation and keeps raging for years instead of months, we could see a permanent movement of people to Western Europe. These conflicts are hard to resolve. The needed manpower and skilled workforce left usually first and won't come back in many cases. While a country can be destroyed in days, rebuilding it needs multiple decades and billions of dollars. And it doesn't make the world safer. One conflict is producing millions of refugees that will flee to neighboring countries. In those countries, money, manpower and resources are needed to sustain the refugee population. So paired with economic problems, the neighboring countries can be destabilized too. And if entities like the UN cannot interfere, a chain reaction could be the consequence. So, how will the future look like? Not safe and not stable. The war in Ukraine triggered a chain reaction, and we will soon see the first dominoes to fall. For example, Russia and Ukraine are both very important wheat exporters to countries in the already struggling MENA region. Lebanon imports 60% and Egypt roughly 80% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. For Egypt, we talk about bread for 80 million people. The country is poor, and many people need state-subsidized bread to survive. If the living conditions get worse, we could see demonstrations and an uprising that could destabilize the country in weeks. So basically, we are moving from stage 1 to 2. And the war in Ukraine is triggering the lowering of living standards in many countries in the world. The worldwide energy crisis and inflation is making it even worse. How many collapsing countries can the world community handle? Don't forget, if one nation fails, its contribution to the world market fails too. People will leave and go to other countries. The chain reaction has already started. The world could see double the number of worldwide refugees in a few years if economic conditions cannot be improved worldwide. As I said before, the worse the economic conditions are, the more likely is internal conflict. And if everyone is fleeing, where will they flee to? It looks like Western nations have seen this coming for quite a while. Europe and the US are turning themselves into fortresses against immigrants. But people have no choice and will try it anyway. The bordering nations of Western blocs, like Turkey or Mexico, will have to handle the bulk of the incoming people. It is very important that the UN and NGOs have the resources and funding they need to relieve the situation as good as they can. The storm will be so big and so severe that any help, how small and insignificant it may seem, is really needed. We cannot allow ourselves to walk blind into this crisis. To be fair, the list of problems we face is long, and every day it's getting longer and more complicated. But this will be painful and dangerous, even in the short term. And let's not forget, we talk about people here. Families and children. There won't be a safe space in this world when we ignore the problem. The world is too small to hide. If the West just want to lock out the world, then we will still feel the consequences. This plan is doomed to fail. There are no simple solutions to complicated problems. It's not that I have a solution, but June 20th is Refugee Day. And instead of talking about the coming crisis, We use that day for the marketing campaigns for big companies and the like. We cannot expect the situation to get better if we don't change something. And the world gets more dangerous with every day. This channel is focusing on this change. How climate change, conflict and politics are shaping our world into something new, but ultimately something worse than before. If you want to see more about this process, then like and subscribe. If you ever wondered why you see less and less insects outside, then check out the video on the left. And on the right, we talk about the year 2030, our dark future. My name is Dennis, thank you for watching and goodbye.